Hey AP Macro students. Okay, so today we're going to put the whole curve together. Okay, so we're going to put aggregate demand and aggregate supply on the same graph. Talk about how it works. So just a review, shifters of aggregate demand are the pieces of GDP, right? So consumer spending, investment spending, government spending, and net exports. Shifters of short run aggregate supply is RAP, R-A-P. So resource prices, actions of the government, which is not government spending, it's different, and productivity. So we're going to put them together. We're going to learn about equilibrium, price level, and output. So this is our ADAS model. We're going to show our economy at full employment, right? So when our economy is at its perfect spot. So here's our axes. There's our aggregate demand curve. There's our short run aggregate supply curve. And our long run aggregate supply cuts right through the middle, right? So you can see here, find the intersection. This is our equilibrium price level and our equilibrium output, right? Our equilibrium GDP. So LRAS is the vertical long run aggregate supply curve. It cuts right through that intersection at that long run equilibrium output level, okay? This is where our economy wants to be. We're going to talk about how these moves, how this thing moves around. This long run line will stay in the same place the whole time. So, assume there is an increase in consumer spending. What happens to price level and output in the short run? Okay. Consumer spending is a piece of aggregate demand. If we increase consumer spending, we're going to increase aggregate demand. So there's our shift to the right, our increase in aggregate demand. We find the new intersection of AD and short run AS right here. This gives us our new price level and our new output, okay? So what happens to the price level and what happens to output in the short run? Price level went up, so prices increased, that's inflation. Output increased, we are now producing more. We're producing at this level, right? So GDP is increased. Price level and quantity both increase in that case, okay? So you know your shifters, you know how this all works, you kind of see the basics here. For right now, don't worry too much about the long run line, okay? It's gonna live there, we'll talk about it in a few slides, but we're gonna do a little practice just shifting curves, okay? So in your notebook, set this up. Draw this table. I'm gonna put up some prompts just like we've done in the past. Pause the video, work through them, okay? Try and draw the shifts, and then I'll put up the answers, and you can check them, okay? So, draw this out, and then I'll put up the prompts, and you can pause the video. Okay, there they are. So, pause the video here, and see if you can draw these shifts. Okay, here's your answers, okay? So you can pause again, see how you did, see if you got them right. So this is which curve is shifting, what is the shifter, and then does it increase or decrease? All right, moving forward. So now let's talk about how we interpret knowledge off of this graph, right? You should understand how it basically moves around now. It's not unlike a supply and demand curve. Now let's kind of learn about how we read this graph. So we're going to talk about inflationary and recessionary gaps here. So our economy can only be in one of three places at any time, okay? So this is our PPC, okay? This is our full employment, which we learned in the last unit is 5% unemployment, right? That's where our economy is working at its happiest. The blue line here is the maximum capacity, right? So this would be 0% unemployment. So yes, it is possible to get out there, but that's not the best place, right? We cannot produce beyond the blue line, but we can produce somewhere in here, right? And then this is our business cycle, right? So peaks, troughs, if we're going downhill, it's a recession. If we're going uphill, we call it expansion. That means our economy is speeding up, okay? So we can be at one of three places. One, we can be at what's a recessionary gap. So we are inside of our full employment line. So this is probably like 8–10% unemployment, right? Or it could be bigger than that, anything under 5%. That's going to put us down here at the trough on the business cycle, right? The yellow dot represents full employment. So that's going to be right here on the full employment line, which is also going to be at the intersection of our trend line here and the business cycle. And then the last dot is the inflationary gap. That's out here, right? So this would be like somewhere between 5% and 0% unemployment. So we're producing, our economy is really moving fast at this point. That's up here at the peak, right? So we can be at one of these three places. Let's look how this looks on the aggregate demand and aggregate supply curve graph. So assume the government increases spending. What happens to price level and output? Okay, so here's our equilibrium aggregate demand and aggregate supply graph. The government's going to increase spending. Government spending increases. That shifts aggregate demand to the right. Okay, what happens to price level and output? Price level goes up, output goes up. Okay, so we see an increase in both. This, when we're out at this point here, right, this is what we call an inflationary gap. So where our AS and AD intersect is to the right of the long run aggregate supply curve. Output is high, unemployment is less than the natural rate. So this is how we would represent our inflationary gap, right? This is our economy kind of moving too hot, right? So that's the inflationary gap. Actual GDP is above potential GDP, right? You can see that down here. This would be our potential at full employment, and this is where our actual GDP is. This is where we were kind of sitting right before the COVID-19 shutdown happened. Our economy was kind of in an inflationary gap. It was moving kind of too fast. Okay, now assume consumer spending falls. What happens to price level and output? Okay, so consumer spending falls, that's going to decrease aggregate demand. Brings us out here, right? Price level went down, output went down. Okay, price level and quantity decrease. This is what we call a recessionary gap. So output is low, unemployment is more than the natural rate of unemployment, right? So if you want you to draw a graph of a recessionary gap, you'll draw the intersection of AS and AD to the left of the long run aggregate supply curve, right? You're starting to see why this is important because it indicates this stuff. Actual GDP is below potential GDP, right? So potential GDP at full employment, actual GDP. Okay, now here's the weird one. If there's a negative supply shock of oil, what happens to price level and output? A negative supply shock is going to shift our aggregate supply curve, right? So AS decreases. So what we see here is the price level has gone up and our output has gone down. So we are in a recessionary gap, right? Our economy is too slow, but prices are still going up. This is probably the worst place we want to be in an economy. We call this stagflation, okay? It gets its own, this graph gets its own special name because it's the bad one. It's what we don't want, right? So output is down, right? We have a stagnant economy because we're in a recession, but we're still experiencing inflation. This is stagflation. And yeah, some estimate that when we come out of this kind of COVID-19 thing, this is where our economy is going to be headed. But I'll send out a reading later that you can read to kind of, it'll explain how all this stuff kind of works. It's optional, but it is interesting. So it's still considered a recessionary gap, but it's its own special beast. We call this stagflation. Okay, so now we kind of know how the graph can be. You can either be in an inflationary gap, you can be in a recessionary gap, right? And you'll see on AP exams, on the FRQs, they'll say, draw an AS/AD curve in an inflationary gap. So that tells you exactly what graph you need to draw. I can almost guarantee that this graph shows up on the AP exam. It's on it almost every single year. It's usually FRQ number 1. This is probably the most important graph to have down in terms of acing the AP exam. So, if consumer spending increases, what will happen in the short run and what will happen in the long run? Okay, so now we've got our ASAD model and we've got our business cycle. Okay, this is our, right now we are at full employment. This is our good, happy economy. So, consumer spending increases, that increases aggregate demand. Okay, so now we see price level go up, output go up. Okay, that puts us up here in the peak of the business cycle. Kind of see how that works? So boom, boom. They talk to each other. They're connected to each other. In the long run, wages and costs increase. Because what you're going to see right here, prices got more expensive for everyone in the economy. And as we learned, they're now going to demand higher wages, right? Resources are also going to get more expensive here. So that's going to have the producers actually force them to produce less, right? So what happens is aggregate supply shifts back to the long run line, right? So basically, I'll walk you through, I'll back up and I'll walk you through it one more time. Oops, sorry. So happy spot, right? Consumer spending increases. We're out here at an inflationary gap. Wages or price level went up, so we saw inflation right here. Workers demand higher wages. Okay, that shifts aggregate supply back to the LRAS, right? So that goes us back to our equilibrium output, but we see quite a bit of inflation that comes out of it. This is why we kind of always have inflation in our economy, is because we come out here and then we move back and we come up and down the peaks of the business cycle. Kind of see how that works? So there's multiple things going on. If consumer spending increases, what will happen in the short run and in the long run? Okay, in the long run, wages and costs increase, right? Wait, sorry, messed myself up here. Okay, that's where we were. Here's where we're at now. So now, if consumer spending decreases, what will happen in the short run and in the long run? Okay, so now consumer spending decreases, aggregate demand shifts to the left. Okay, we're now in a recessionary gap. We saw prices go down. So in theory, in the long run, wages and costs eventually decrease. So wages in theory go down, right? And that shifts us back down here to the LRAS. That's how it works in a perfect academic world, right? If our consumer spending decreases, we're in a recession, people will accept lower wages, and it shifts us back, right? I know the question you want to ask is, when was the last time you heard of someone's wages going down? But you do see elements of, like, they'll put pay raise freezes on, so that's actually going to decrease people's wages over time. Like, you won't get a raise for several years after a recession, things like that. So it does kind of happen, but it's not as black and white as the other direction. So that's how the curve works, right? If we're in a recessionary gap, we're going to eventually shift AS to put us back into long run equilibrium. And if we're in an inflationary gap, we'll shift AS from there. So let's practice, okay? Assume there is an increase in government spending. What happens to price level and output in the short run? Increase in government spending is part of GDP. That's going to increase aggregate demand. Boom, okay? Price level went up, output went up. In the short run, that's what happens, okay? We see an increase in price level and an increase in quantity. Okay, now consumer expectations fall and consumer spending plummets. What happens to price level and output in the long run? Okay, so now we're going to have less consumer spending. We're going to decrease aggregate demand, okay? In the long run, workers will accept lower wages. and we shift our aggregate supply curve back to the long run aggregate supply. So price level decreases and output stays the same. If consumer spending increases, what happens to price level and output in the long run? So now we're going to shift back out here, right? In the long run, things got more expensive, right? This is inflation. Therefore, the workers are going to demand higher wages, and aggregate supply is going to shift back up here to the long run aggregate supply curve. Price level increases, output stays the same. The last piece to talk about is economic growth. So, if investments increase, what happens in the short run and long run? So, investment increases, right? That's investment spending. It increases our aggregate demand in the short run. This is the weird part. Because this is investment increasing, this is companies buying more capital stock. Okay, so they're buying new factories, new machinery, things like that. The machinery and tools purchased by businesses will increase their total output, right? So they buy new capital, it allows them to produce more, which is what we see here, right? But what happens in this case, they now have this new machinery. So our aggregate supply curve doesn't shift back to the long run curve. Aggregate supply is going to shift out, right? Investment spending allows them to supply more, right? And we end up with a new long run aggregate supply, right? This is what happens when an economy grows. You need capital stock. You need investment in business spending, right? You need new machinery to make this happen. This is the PPC, right? We now have shifted our whole PPC curve, right? So when the long run curve moves, that's economic growth. It only really happens when businesses increase capital, right? That's the one piece you got to look for. So if an increase in consumption of government spending doesn't cause any economic growth, right? Only investment causes growth since firms increase their capital stock. So that wraps up how this graph works. Like I said before, this is probably the most important graph that you need to know. Almost every single year, it's FRQ number 1, and being that you guys are going to take an all FRQ test, I can pretty much guarantee you're going to be drawing this graph. So practice with it, make sure you're comfortable with it, make sure you can draw an inflationary gap and a recessionary gap and all those pieces, and you'll be good to go. All right, thanks guys.